Christ is in our midst. Today is the first Sunday of Great Lent, the Sunday of Orthodoxy, often called the Triumph of Orthodoxy. Historically, the Church liturgical cycle commemorates the restorative reincorporation of holy icons into the spiritual and social life of the Church. The term triumph serves as a reminder of the theological, social, and even volatile fight for both the correct use of doctrine and the rightful role that religious materiality, icons, have in the construction, practice, and dissemination of orthodoxy. Since the 840s, with Empress Theodora's bold intervention, the practice of using icons has been restored, and the Church has proclaimed the Sunday of Orthodoxy as the liturgical marker celebrating the end of the horrific iconoclastic years. These were years in which those who venerated and used icons in liturgical practice were persecuted and even martyred for their firm theological support of iconography. The Sunday of Orthodoxy is a triumph over the heresy of iconoclasm, the breaking of images. At the same time, it is also a day for us to reflect upon the fact that icons are spiritual mirrors. While icons show us the saintly possibilities for illumination, they also reflect our own spiritual state, our failings, our humanness. The triumph of orthodoxy, our celebration of the divine images, our rebuke of iconoclasm, should always be in tandem with the humble recognition of our own weak humanity and daily failings. In 1985, Father Alexander Schmemann of blessed memory gave a sermon for the Sunday of Orthodoxy, during which he recounted the iconoclastic struggles of the Church, the persecution of laity, and those who held fast to the iconographic practices of worship. He also suggested that the Church did not have to struggle with heresies as it did centuries ago. Rather, it has the struggle of unity to contend with. I agree with Father Alexander on the issue of unity as pressing for orthodoxy, but ultimately I see that unity in the Orthodox Church, particularly in the United States, as being contingent upon rooting out heretical ideologies of racism that have been resurfacing in the Church recently. We've come a long way since the civil rights era, when Archbishop Iakovos of blessed memory stood resolute in his decision to fight against bias and prejudice alongside other faith leaders. In that time, our world and our country has once again experienced the insidiousness of racism rising. Our Church is not immune to it. While the restoration of icons was a theological win for historical orthodoxy, we sadly cannot triumph in what the Church looks like today. On a global scale, orthodoxy is experiencing social and political crises of unprecedented scale, in which religious leaders are using theological language to perpetrate violence toward countries and people with whom they ideologically disagree. Some are even backing the genocidal war of an authoritarian leader through anti-Semitism, a form of racism coded as theological opinion about eschatology or the end times. In the United States, orthodoxy is in a social crisis. There are growing ideas and movements steeped in white Christian nationalism, an ideology that blends conspiratorial fears about white genocide with ethno-nationalism, racism, anti-Semitism, and misogyny that are not just part of the online Orthodox culture or social media, but are equally as at home during parish coffee hours and even in the writing and output of some clerics. How can this be? In 1872, the Constantinople Council decreed, "We censure, condemn, and declare contrary to the teachings of the gospel and the sacred canons of the Holy Fathers the doctrine of philautism, or the difference of races and national diversity in the bosom of the Church of Christ." While the Council was writing in a far different political and social moment than the one we are experiencing today, their decree is timeless in its theological significance. It condemns racial segregation in the Church ecclesiastically. Right now in the United States, ecclesiastical segregation, the division of the body of Christ based on race, is not in many respects an institutionalized problem from the top down. However, at the same time, there are clergy and laity who espouse racialized ideas and anxieties like white Christian nationalism and anti-Semitism that have no place in the Church. Because Orthodoxy is statistically small and geographically diffuse in the U.S., many believers will take to the internet to find friends. They will often use social media, listen to podcasts, and link up with fellow travelers without encountering racism, without encountering radicalized notions of nationalism that are xenophobic. Thank God. Yet, it is there, and it is not just part of online orthodoxy. We live in a digital age, and the digital world is not pretend. The things talked about, written about, and discussed online have effects in our daily lives, in our parishes offline. The stars and bars should not be venerated. White genocide discourse should not be utilized by believers, and anti-Semites most certainly should not be asked to speak at jurisdictionally sanctioned events. This is not the triumph of orthodoxy. This is contemporary heresy. This is iconoclasm. This is the breaking of divine images. This is the corruption of the faith, and this must not stand. There can be no triumph of orthodoxy rooted in subjugation. The present and future triumph of orthodoxy can only be fully manifested if, as Orthodox Christians, we condemn racism fomenting in our communities, acknowledge and work toward uprooting misogyny, and actively assert that anti-Semitism is a racist heresy that has no place in orthodoxy. This requires each of us not to dismiss racism when we see it and hear it, but to call it out actively. We must, as Orthodox Christians, be committed to rooting out injustice. We must be committed to standing against bias, to reminding each other, as Archbishop Yakovos reminded us during the Civil Rights Movement, that we cannot be Christians in name and not in spirit and action. Ask yourself today and every day, what action will I take? The triumph of orthodoxy succeeds or fails every second of every day in our hearts and actions. As we process around our parishes and even into the streets on this first Sunday of Lent, carrying high our icons, holding images of the patron saints, festal scenes, the Mother of God, and Christ himself, we need look no further than those processing with us to see living icons. Our glory in the preservation of wooden, metal, and stone icons must be met with an even greater reverence for the fleshly ones we encounter daily. Some scholars say we're living through a new civil war, a slow civil war. Others call it the culture wars. Whatever the case may be, the social fissures that we are witnessing all around us, including in our parishes, are partially due to the lack of iconographic acknowledgement that each of us is an icon of God. The reverence we show each other, or the lack thereof, passes to the archetype, passes to God. When handling painted or wooden icons, we are generally mindful that each of them is a window to heaven, a portal through which we participate in the divine spark of holiness. We must ask ourselves why we fail to treat human beings, living icons, with the same respect. Each of us needs to be mindful of the words of Father Alexander Schmemann when he says, "Let us, from now on, feel responsible for each other. Let us understand that even if we are divided in small parishes, in small dioceses, we first of all belong to each other. We belong together to Christ, to his body, to the church. Let us feel responsible for each other, and let us love one another." Father Alexander's words echo the teachings of Christ in the 13th chapter of John, where he proclaims to his disciples, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you love also one another. By this will all know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." In the span of 2 sentences, Christ uses the word love 4 times. The message of Christ, as evident through the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels, is clear in its aim. Love, incandescent, divinely lit love, is not one that seeks being right, being antagonistic, being bigoted. Rather, love begins with the acknowledgement of the human person as a living icon, of Christ, the incarnate God. Love continues to venerate, to care for, to accept without reservation. In this Lenten season, let us recall the words of Christ. Let us challenge ourselves and each other to root out racism. Remind radical Orthodox Christians we encounter that Orthodoxy is not about hate, it is not about nationalism, and it is most certainly not about a politics of exclusion. On this Sunday of Orthodoxy, and every day, let us commit ourselves to the radical love of Christ and to the care, acceptance, and respect of us, God's living icons. Amen.